Supercluster, Scatter Signal, Appetence, Lethophobia, Scalar Potential, Doomed Petitioner. All craftable, all with incredible names. But are they any good? Let's start with Supercluster. Supercluster's main use case is dealing damage to bosses when there's a matching overcharge or surge modifier active for the activity. You may be wondering if it's got anything on Heritage, the current legendary king of slug shotguns. And the answer is, it depends on how unhinged you are. But more on that in a second. If you just like slugs and you're looking for something to complement your strand build in everyday content, it's absolutely fine. My role recommendation would be Slice or Threat Detector with Surrounded. The new perk Slice allows you to sever targets after you use your class ability, which reduces the damage they can do to you. It does feel best suited for hunters who dodge more often than politicians, but it's a very unique perk that may help with some survival situations. Threat Detector is a very known quantity at this stage, and it synergizes well with Surrounded, which boosts this weapon's damage by 40% in PvE, thus really putting the super in Supercluster. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry for that. I didn't honestly, Twitch chat made me do it. Twitch.tv/Ascendant Nomad, by the way. Now, the unhinged thing to do would be to look at this and try and make it compete with Heritage. Because even though Heritage has a 15% damage boost over Supercluster by virtue of it being a kinetic ammo weapon, Supercluster rolls perks that are very interesting from a DPS perspective, such as Reconstruction and Vorpal, but also Reconstruction and Cascade Point, which has never been seen before in the game up until now. Now, I am not Astacross or Aegis or any DPS tester, but I feel like if you can set it up consistently, it could be an interesting option to have for a DPS rotation, especially if the damage windows are very narrow. That being said, it's hard to imagine anyone actively choosing to do this for any other reason than the big funny. In PvP, shotguns and slugs are kind of in a weird spot with the meta right now, but if you're a slug enjoyer regardless, then you'll like this weapon. Your options are limited, but they're effective. Slide Shot and Threat Detector in column 3, and Fragile Focus in column 4. It's very easy to max out the range in crafting and performs just like any other slug in the game right now. There's not much to say here. It's a slug shotgun. But is this weapon any good? It's very interesting, and I think there's a few roles worth trying out for your strand builds. That being said, I believe Until Its Return from Season of the Deep is a better strand shotgun overall, and Heritage is still hard to beat because it's kinetic. Moving on to Scatter Signal, and pay attention to this one. Fusions have two important roles at the minute, annoying SMG users in the Crucible and being part of a DPS rotation. To that end, Scatter Signal can do both. Scatter Signal can roll Controlled Burst, the first rapid fire frame to be able to do so. Making a fusion rifle fire faster is always nice to do, but what really sells this as a DPS rotation option is the fact that it can roll with Overflow, boosting the mag size up to 14. That makes it incredibly handy to have when swapping with, say, an Apex Predator with Reconstruction, or allowing Dragon's Breath to autoload itself. Controlled Burst on Scatter Signal is not a straightforward perk to proc, however, because you have to land every bolt. On a rapid fire frame, you have 9 bolts, which is a lot higher than, say, Eremite's 5, and the grouping of these bolts is noticeably wider than other fusion archetypes. If you're on controller especially, it can be a nightmare to control. Thankfully, you can craft this thing to be more manageable by fully speccing into stability. The higher the stability, the tighter the grouping. Something to keep in mind is that its origin trait, Dragon's Vengeance, will refill your magazine and decrease charge time even further if you reach critical health or an ally dies. It's not going to happen all the time, but it's a little nice to have in certain situations. For PvP, rapid fires are flying a little under the radar at the minute. They are very capable and very easy to control if you spec for stability, and are the perfect solution for the Peacekeeper Immortal Titan that refuses to move on. There's a couple of roles here that make sense. Perpetual Motion and Kickstart is the movement-based combo that synergizes well, but don't sleep on Encore and Adagio. After getting one kill, Adagio will slow your charge rate by 20%, but offer you 30% higher damage per bolt, as well as 10 additional range, which isn't something you should ignore for PvP. The best pairing for this is Encore, which also activates after a kill and boosts range and stability with each kill you get. Basically, with this combo, the more you kill, the scarier the gun actually becomes. It's a terrifying thing to wield if you're capable with fusion rifles. If you want the best of both worlds, consider Perpetual with Adagio or Encore with Kickstart. You really can't go wrong with any combination of these perks. But is this any good? Without a doubt, I honestly think that with Overflow and Control Burst in PvE, this gun is an absolute winner. In PvP, if you're a master of fusions, you're going to want to craft this immediately. It's probably one of the best in the game right now. Trace rifles are what primary ammo should be in PvE, and Appetence has broken through as the first legendary trace rifle in the game. And it's a fairly good one, if a little unspectacular. Trace rifles are generally very good in PvE, and their primary role is ad clearing. In PvP, they're a wildcard option that ranks sort of middle of the pack in terms of effectiveness. To that end, here's a few roles to consider. For PvE, Column 3 has Demolitionist and Overflow as its standouts. Demolitionist makes the most sense if you're using this for a build, whilst Overflow makes sense for ad management in enemy-dense content. In Column 4, we have Headstone and One For All as the default picks. One For All is a 35% damage buff when you tag 3 separate enemies, which is far easier than killing them outright, and Headstone is again one of the most classic stasis utility options. Personally, I'm going to go with Demolitionist and One For All because it's a perfect hybrid between ad clear and utility. In PvP, well, Hipfire Grip is really the only mildly PvP oriented perk in a sea of PvE options. So that and Killing Tally, I guess? It's not a PvP weapon, and if you wanted to use a trace, there are better options out there. Is it any good? By virtue of it being the only legendary stasis trace in the game, yes. Yes it is. It's a familiar package, and it's overall unspectacular, but you should craft this. Now, if you haven't seen Cool Guy's video on Lethophobia yet, allow me to explain to you why you need to pay attention here. This is the first ever lightweight bow that rolls with Disruption Break. For the knowers, that's enough. They're on the way to craft it right now. But for those who aren't aware, Disruption Break is a very niche utility perk that enables a very interesting playstyle for those inclined. Disruption Break states, breaking an enemy shield with this weapon makes them more vulnerable to kinetic damage for a short period. Okay, but you might be asking how much more vulnerable and for how long? Well, how does 50% and 5.5 seconds sound? That's right. Break a target shield with this weapon and your kinetic weapons do 50% more damage than normal to that same target. In PvP, break a shield with a headshot, swap to any quick draw hand cannon and body shot to clean up. It's not the fastest time to kill that you've ever seen, but it is very consistent and it is very hard to play against. For PvP, it's got to be Steady Hands and Disruption Break. On the off chance you get a kill with the bow, Steady Hands gives you quick draw and snapshot for all of your weapons for 8.5 seconds. When it comes to stats, try to minimize draw time whilst also boosting accuracy. Lightweight bows tend to ghost entirely if you're not fully drawn or have low accuracy. Draw time masterwork, polymer string, and fiberglass arrow shaft are worth considering here. So is this any good? If you haven't seen it already all over comp and trials, expect to. Right now it's got big flavor of the month energy, but that doesn't mean it's not a genuine menace. Scalar Potential is a wonderful name for something that really doesn't have a lot of scalable potential. It's an arc rapid-fire pulse rifle, the fourth of its kind after Darkest Before, Horror's Least, and Oversoul Edict. Rapid-fire pulses are generally only good for one thing: 6v6 game modes in PvP. You can use them in threes, but their base damage tends to be too low for most situations. In PvE, they don't really have the damage to cope with anything, really. To that end, the only way to look at this is from a PvP perspective, and even then, it's not exactly favorable. Statistically, things don't seem to look all that great for Scalar. It's on the low side on range, stability, aim assist, and recoil direction, all of the key stats that you want to be good for rapid fire pulses. On the perk side of things, it's not much better either, with Enlightened Action and Keep Away in column 3, and Golden Tricorn and Headseeker in column 4. No combination of these will blow your mind. Headseeker does nothing to the overall forgiveness of rapid fire pulses, and Golden Tricorn is just... it's fine. Feel-wise, it's also very unspectacular. Again, it's fine, it's not a hard weapon to use, but it sure as hell isn't an easy one either. So is this any good? Sorry, no, it's not. This one's an easy skip. Scalar Potential is basically Oversoul Edict at home, which is a shame. Right, time to sit up straight again because Doom Petitioner is the new king of void linear fusion rifles. Yes, you heard me right, but there's some caveats. Heavy linears are exclusively used for boss DPS. They're not ad clear monsters, they're single shot, fuck off damage types. In the case of Doomed Petitioner, it's an aggressive frame linear, so it fires a 3-round burst. This fact alone either makes this one of the best linear fusions in the game, or one of the worst, depending on the situation. more on that in a second. The perk combination that should get you in a tizzy is Envious Assassin with Precision Instrument. With Enhanced Battery and Envious, you should have 15 shots in the mag with no downtime to unload into a boss, and with 6 stacks of Precision Instrument, you'll be doing 30% more damage than normal as long as you hit those crits or get another crit within 1.25 seconds of missing one. It remains to be seen if this ends up being more than Cataclysmic with Bait and Switch, but it comfortably clears Taipan with Firing Line and Threaded Needle with Vorpal, both of which only add 20% and 15% respectively. For Void Linears, there really isn't a better option as long as you can hit those crits. Now, of course, this is wholly dependent on as long as you can hit those crits. There's a myriad of factors that might be preventing you from doing exactly that. Maybe the boss is roaming. Maybe the boss's crit box is too small. Maybe the boss is too close. Maybe you're playing solo and you have to juggle a lot of things. Maybe you just can't hit your shots. These problems do extend to normal linears as well, it's just that the aggressive frame linears split their damage across each of their bolts in the burst, so it is imperative that you're perfect to get the maximum out of this archetype. So if you can do it, and if the stars align and you're comfortable hitting those shots, this should shoot right to the top of your considerations for a linear fusion DPS situation. It can also roll with Surrounded, which is a 40% damage buff if there's enemies around. But if you're not sure or you're not confident in your shots, keep the Taipan and Cataclysmic. Bait and Switch is a lot easier to get going for comparable results. So is this any good? Absolutely, but it's not the easiest thing to live with. This one may prove tricky, but it absolutely performs. Now before we sign off, let's briefly consider how they stack up with their slot rivals and what they offer from a loadout perspective. Scalar Potential is the only one which I do not see a use for under any circumstance, at least not whilst Oversoul Edict is obtainable. Lethophobia 2 has a one and done use case which appeals to a very specific subset of players. You either see the value in it or you don't, and that's fine. Supercluster as a strand shotgun is okay, but truthfully there isn't a place for it in people's loadouts. Swordbreaker, the courtesan shotgun, is superior to it, especially with its origin trait, until its return is better from an ad clearing or build perspective, and Heritage just outclasses it for double slug DPS. I do feel that for most people, the setup for a Cascade Point DPS situation won't be worth doing over something more straightforward. Plus you have to be a certain type of crazy to even entertain that, which most people are not. Scatter Signal has some future as a DPS option with Overflow and Controlled Burst, but a question needs to be asked whether this is worth giving up the slot normally reserved for a Chill Clip Riptide or Deliverance. It will wholly depend on the encounter, the boss itself, and just what the DPS situation calls for, not to mention the person actually creating the loadout. But for solo content, if the damage holds up, I could see Scatter Signal finding a lot of use. Appetence's value really lies in how set you are on running a Stasis build in the current year. Stasis has been outclassed by Strand in virtually every respect, but if you need to match your surges, then you'd be hard pressed to not have Appetence by your side. And finally, Doomed Petitioner is really good for DPS, especially if the crit box is massive or there's a divinity on the team. It's a void version of Briar's Contempt, ridiculous ceiling with a high cost of entry. It's definitely worth keeping one around. And that's it. Hope this video clears up what exactly you're looking for. A big thanks to the patrons for continuing to make these videos possible. I'm Ascendant Nomad, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.